night to everyone. My name is Daniel Barreiros. I'm from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro, from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I'm a professor, a history professor, and I work with the history of warfare and of course with big history, big history perspective to warfare. I hope you can all understand my English. If you have any problem, please just tell me so that I can fix any problems in my speech. The name of this presentation is War Inside My Head, Ethology in the Transdominial Mind. I hope I have some time to explain what is a transdominial mind. Ethology is something more established, so to say. This is an ongoing project. So in all these opportunities of presentations, I develop a little more this reflection about warfare in a big history perspective. So some of you may have heard me before, so you may know what I'm about to say. But if you don't, it will be entirely new for you. Well, let's start. So the whole idea is we can only understand warfare, we can only understand collective violence among human societies in depth if we take a big history perspective, because warfare can be many things depending on the scale you are analyzing. First, here in this slide, we have four of eight major thresholds in big history, from life to the modern revolution. And warfare can be different things depending on the threshold you are considering. The most common definition for war or warfare is the interstation violence in the international arena. It's war as we know in most of the modern societies. So war in this perspective must involve a state, must involve an organized army, weapons, etc., etc., and politics, of course. If you understand it through a Clausewitzian lens, it must involve politics in some way. It's the continuation of politics by other means or with other means. So that's the most common definition for warfare, and that's the most common definition that we see in political science and international relations studies. But war and warfare are not just this. It's not just this. It's more. It's more than this, because you can have war among stateless societies, for example, something that violates the idea that war, it's the interstate violence. When we assume this level of analysis, and when we go back to threshold 6, when Homo sapiens appears and the collective learning is the major theme in this threshold, you can understand warfare as organized violence between different polities, state or stateless. Then we enter the realm of archaeology, we enter the realm of anthropology, especially the anthropology of war. But it's not enough. To a big historian perspective, it's not enough. There's a more external layer. Yeah? If we go back to thresholds 5, if you understand warfare as a life phenomenon or death phenomenon, if you do prefer, if we see war and warfare as collective intersocial violence between primates, being them human or non-human. Why I'm telling you this? Because humans are not the only primate species that engages in a sort of social relationship that we can label as war. We can label as a violent collective conflict. Chimpanzees do the same. And considering that chimpanzees are the most the primate species most proximate from humans in terms of their DNA, we share 99% approximately of DNA with chimpanzees, and they are on our lineage. So we may assume, of course, with a grain of salt, we can assume that this kind of behavior of organizing collectives to engage war against foreign collectives, it's a kind of innate or ethological trace that we share with chimpanzees along all the 6 million years that separates us from them. Of course, we must assume, or we must take in consideration the possibility that uh, collective violence developed in humans and chimpanzees in different moments, at different moments. It's a possibility, but it's a less probable possibility than the one I'm exploring here. That these two species share this common trait since their last common ancestor 6 million years ago. So you may ask me, oh, so yeah, so that's this is the most general definition of warfare, and what we should do with the other definitions. We should take them together because war is also interstate violence, is also organized violence between different polities, and is also collective intersocial violence between primates. It's all the same. I think that's the wonder of big history, is our capacity to look to a same object through in different scales, and understand that in different scales they are different things, in spite of the fact that all these things are interrelated. So every war that happens today, it's also organized violence between different polities, and it's also collective intersocial violence between primates, and it's not without consequence. We have to consider this carefully. So, the title of this presentation is "War Inside My Head," because I think war is in this general perspective is mainly a cognitive phenomenon before everything else. It's not this do not makes the other perspectives less important, but this is the most general thing we can perceive, that war is a cognitive phenomenon, because you can only have war, we can only have collective violence if the procedures and the objectives of this collective intersocial violence are conceived and understood by its agents. They must conceive and understand what they are doing, even if this understanding, even if this conception operates in an unconscious level. That what happens among chimpanzees, and we think, me and most of the archaeology of mind researchers think that most of our past human species acted in the same way. They didn't understood, as we understand what a social act is. They do all these things unconsciously. So there's no collective violence if the actors do not act accordingly to it. There are rules, and that are not rules of engagement necessarily, but there are rules of societal action that leads to collective violence among humans and among chimpanzees, and I think in all our lineage. Therefore, waging war is a behavior phenomenon before everything else, as I said before. Uh, what I think we share with them, what I think it's common between humans and between chimpanzees, is this ethology of conflict resolution. But you may ask me, Daniel, but you are talking, you're speaking here about warfare, you're speaking here about violence. Why are you talking about conflict resolution? Because the collective violence results from the failure of conflict resolution ethology in chimpanzees. In humans, things can be pretty different because we have the capacity of simulating all these ethological contents. We can operate them through culture. That what makes us so dangerous. I'll get there. So what we have in common with chimpanzees in this perspective? We have this ethology of conflict resolution. Why that? Because chimpanzees and humans and Homo sapiens are social species with very complex societies, with a high level of individuality in all these cognitive agents that makes a social group. So it's expected that uh, uh, interpersonal conflict in societies like that may rise to the level of lethal violence. It's very common. Most of primate species, they have very good mechanisms to prevent lethal violence inside their social groups. Chimpanzees have also this kind of conflict resolution ethology. So, and humans as well. But it's very important because the possibility of lethal conflicts inside the group may undermine the group stability. So we see what happened in chimpanzees. They have very fluid hierarchies. They are not like gorillas, for example, that have a very straight hierarchy and with power positions very clear and no contests of power or very limited contests of power, etc., etc. In chimpanzees, not doesn't happen this way, and in humans as well. We have these societies that are that are highly competitive, and the power positions and status positions and the prestige positions are always changing, and it happens through conflict. We know how it happens. We work in companies, and we see how human politics works in state societies. We know that conflict is the most important thing to mediate the dispute of positions. And and uh, and if chimpanzees and humans, if they have not they don't have a mechanism to prevent them from killing themselves every time they disagree with each other, we won't be here. They won't be there, you know. So that's the cornerstone of warfare. It's the capacity of not engaging in lethal violence, because this vast array of prosocial instruments, they operate with a very high energy cost. It's very associated with the size of brains, for example, especially the prefrontal cortex. That's the most important part of the brain that's responsible for mediating the social relations. And and but the problem is, as considering that the operation of these mechanisms are very have a high energy cost, they may face a failure if the processing capacity of these mechanisms is go beyond a processing limit. So when we see this in chimpanzees, when there's social information overload, when chimpanzees are unable to compute what is the relative social position of of a n+1 member of the group, their brains literally go crazy. They can't understand who is this new guy. What is his social position in relation to me and to this to other members, And as this happens, chimpanzees are unable to process social information, and if they can't process social information, they can't apply pro-social behavior to their comrades, and they start to killing them. They start to kill themselves. Before this happens, chimpanzees groups they undergo secession. They separate in space. Their members go to different places, and homeostasis comes back to place. The social relationships social relations are again stabilized. We can see this happen so clearly in humans because we have culture. And culture is a gigantic buffer to prevent these things from happening. I won't enter in this subject here, in this topic here, but it's happening in humans as well, and it's documented, and how can I say this? It's tested in laboratory, even considering that laboratory conditions are not real conditions, but there's a lot of evolutionary psychology studies that I won't say that they demonstrate this, but they suggest that humans undergo the same processes as chimpanzees. So when we have two groups of chimpanzees that split, one that split from the other, and they form different groups in different territories, they are not able to apply pro-social mechanisms to each other. So the members of the out group are not subject to this pro-social behavior, and it happens what I call a situation of weapons free. The collective violence is actually ethologically sanctioned. You don't have to respect someone who is not inside your social pyramid. You just can't kill him or eat him or her as well. And that's how chimpanzees do make war. There are no civil wars among chimpanzees. Wars between them are only between different groups that once were part of a same group, but now are different groups, and they literally kill each other. They make no prisoners, etc., etc. What happens with humans? We can say about humans are able to do better. Yes, they can do better, but not much better. Uh, 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 in the evolution of human mind, human mind was constructed by adding different cognitive domains to our psyche. The first domain, what I'm calling domain here, a cognitive domain, it's a group of brain areas that operate together in order to regulate some kind of behavior. And it's it has a high energy cost, but it's highly effective. Much more than the operation of different modules that are cognitive modules that don't act together. When you make these modules act together to form a domain, you gain a lot of efficiency, but it has a high level energy cost. But natural selection normally select for this kind of domain if the environmental conditions demand. So the first domain that appeared was a social domain, and chimpanzees, they have this social domain. They are able to make hypotheses about social matter, social issues, for example. They can, for example, think, they can guess who is the enemy of whom, just watching social interactions, for example. They understand social relations, making hypotheses about these relationships. They test in their minds. That's what a cognitive domain do. And many other domains were appeared in our in the development of humankind, considering from Homo habilis from Homo sapiens. And they are the social domain, the natural domain, our understanding of how nature functions, how the plants and other animals and the weather, etc., and to make hypotheses about this domain. In the technical domain, how we can manipulate material, how can we manipulate the things around us in order to make these things that we want them to do. How we can make a stone tool, how we can make a bone tool, how we can dam a river, how etc. All of this comes from the technical intelligence, the technical domain. But Homo sapiens went beyond this, because Homo sapiens has all these domains plus a transdominial domain. The transdominial domain, he is able to combine all these different domains in creative ways. For example, there's this image that I think it's great to illustrate what I'm trying to say. For example, you can ask a child, you can show a child, for example, a plastic lion, for example, a toy, yeah? A plastic lion or a plastic, a walrus, whatever, any animal, and you can ask the child, what is this? What is this? The child won't say, oh, this is a piece of plastic. She or he will say, oh, this is a lion or a I don't know, even a dragon or whatever, something imaginary or not. Because the child, as Homo sapiens, is able to combine her understanding of nature and apply this understanding to something that is not a natural, it is not a living thing. And she can metaphorically say that this plastic piece is a lion. This is transdominion. This is the transdominial mind operating. So this transdominial mind is able to mix this once discrete ethological domains. Now can mix this in this all encompassing whole. That's our mind. So it can create very creative combinations. It can create very strange combinations. It can lead to what we call mind diseases, whatever. You can do bad and good things. You can do many things. And in this transdominial mind is totally related to how humans make war and why they make war. We have here in this slide a piece of a newspaper speaking about the war on drugs. We don't make war on drugs. We don't know. We can't do this. Drugs are not agents of war. We can't wage war on drugs. We can only do this metaphorically, as the child who says that the piece of plastic is a lion. You know, this is very important because considering that we humans we are able to combine this ethological content in very creative ways, we can use the archetype of war to illustrate or to cognize different situations. For example, in political violence, for example, in political violence, some people using culture, using cultural content, you turn in-group members provisionally in out-group members. You do like chimpanzees, provisionally. You don't have to undergo secession. That in that moment, I am, like, for example, I am an agent of political violence. Before I act violently, the one who is being violented, who is being hurt by me, belong to my in group. We are together in the same city. We are together in this under the same laws. We have to respect each other as we can. But when we engage in political violence, I can provisionally turn this person in an out group member, and I'm able to catalyze. I'm able to bring this warfare ethology that makes me hurt someone, even considering that this person is my neighbor or even a family member, etc., etc. In extremist discourse, for example, it's another example. The categorization of in-group members as enemies in order to deactivate pro-social behavior complex. When I act in an extremist way, I'm trying to make people around me look to someone else, to a person that belongs to a certain group, to look to this person as enemy, and I'm trying to deactivate the pro-social behavior of all these persons around me. This is a mechanism that non-state societies use to engage in war, for example. All these rituals and the dehumanization and the war painting. When non-state warriors they prepare themselves to war, they construct in their minds the idea that the other is not human, and that can be destroyed, And in extremist discourse in modern societies, we can see this happen every day. And I'm talking from Brazil. We are living this here as at daily basis, and I think in the US, something close to this is happening as well. And the other example is when you consider speciesism, for example. That is the categorization of a given species as an enemy in order to channel collective violence against this species. You use the same techniques, the same cultural techniques to unleash ethological contents that will drive our behavior towards someone or towards some group or some species or etc., etc. So what's very dangerous about humans is that collective violence and pro-social behavior can be activated regardless of environmental cues. In chimpanzees can only activate their behavior in the proper stereotypical environmental situations. Humans can simulate with culture these environments and can activate or deactivate this ethology mostly at will. So cultural activation, it can bypass the need for environmental cues, allowing for instrumentalization of human ethology. That's the major theme that I'm working with in this research. Just to sum up, let's go to the end of this presentation. So humans can activate innate ethological behavior through cultural practices. Warfare depends. Warfare being regular warfare between a clash of armies, etc., yeah? Or warfare in these situations that I told you before, you know, extremism, speciesism, etc. It depends on the suppression of pro-sociality in the activation of collective violence complexes. So transmodularity imbues the human mind with behavior fluidity. That's this capacity of mixing all this ethological content. And it means that our human ethology can be used can be purposefully activated in the self or in others. We can see it in the Facebook, in the Instagram, and mostly in Twitter. We can see all heavy doses of ethology being activated all the time. It can be combined in creative ways. It can be employed in order to produce behavior regardless of environment. It also means that human primate ethology can be manipulated on massive scale. It's really, really dangerous. And this represents a security issue in complex societies. Our policymakers must understand this aspect, this big history aspect. We are not, unfortunately, we are not the rational and enlightened minds the 19th century thought of us. And this vulnerability becomes greater as communication technologies become more efficient and widespread. So the same thing that can help us become a single species or a single whole, a humankind, etc., the same instrument can tear us apart. That's how my conclusion. Yeah. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. That was my presentation, and I'm here to hear what we have to say. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. Excellent presentation. And I guess I will ask everyone if you would kindly jot down your questions, hold your questions, and then after the three presentations, we will be opening it up for discussion because there will be a lot to talk about. But for now, I guess let me ask Anthony to open up his screen and introduce Professor Anthony Lopez. We're delighted that he is going to be speaking. He's a professor in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs at Washington State University, and he will be talking about the universality and uniqueness of extremist violence. Thank you, Anthony, and I think you should be able to share your screen if you want to.
Okay, thanks. I don't need to share my screen because I didn't prepare PowerPoint slides. I intended this to be a bit of a less formal shared discussion, a meditation almost, if you will. So I'm just going to share with you some points, and hopefully I can save the bulk of our investigation for the discussion and exchange, because as I've said to others already privately, I feel like that's really where we get the big benefit of these kinds of things is in the Q&A and the direct exchanges. So I'm going to start by just giving a very brief overview of my talk, since I'm not going to be using PowerPoint slides, in order to help provide a bit of structure that can anchor the particulars that I'm going to present today. It's not going to be a very long talk either. So first, I'd like to begin very briefly by outlining my own background and what I think are three big principles that have guided my research on pretty much most questions I've looked at. After that, I'd like to introduce a simple two-way distinction for thinking about the causes of behavior, somewhat generally, and then apply them to the puzzle of violent extremism. So I'm not going to introduce any hypotheses here. Rather, I'm simply offering one perspective on the Necker cube of human violence that I have found helpful for making sense of something that at first blush anyways might appear extremely novel and unprecedented and complicated, which is of course modern extremist violence. So first, the brief background overview, and then these three principles. And so this is where I've sort of the approach that I have brought to these kinds of questions. So by training, I'm basically a political economist with a heavy focus on psychology and conflict. I say political economist because my two graduate degrees are in economics and political science, but my PhD occurred largely under the tutelage of Rose McDermott, who's a political psychologist, and John Tooby and Lita Cosmides, who are, of course, evolutionary psychologists. And so I have that sort of motley interdisciplinary perspective, as I think we all do, and I try and bring it to bear on this question. So I'm interested in the psychological foundations, psychological underpinnings of coalitional aggression. I'm interested in the psychological architecture that we possess as humans that makes it all happen, so to speak. So my research in this very broad area builds on and reflects three principles. First, very simply, the human brain has been shaped in distinct and knowable ways by natural selection, operating over millions of years of natural selection, of evolution. Second, this evolutionary history has produced a brain that consists largely, but not exclusively, of complex adaptations that were designed to do things that were adaptive in the environments in which our species evolved, even if the modern environment is, of course, now very different. Third, one set of psychological adaptations that humans possess is what evolutionary psychologists call a coalitional psychology. And this refers to the collection of adaptations designed to shape reasoning, motivation, and behavior in the many contexts of group living. And of course, perhaps the most important challenge that we confront as a group is the presence of other groups. Ancestral intergroup relations, much as today, carried with them the potential for trade and wealth and cooperation, as well as the possibility of aggression and violence. So the many challenges of group living clearly would have held tremendous material and reproductive consequences for our ancestors. And this means that it's possible that natural selection would have shaped our brains to process information and regulate behavior in the context of group interaction in ways that would have been ancestrally adaptive. So now, having outlined those three principles, I like to widen the scope a bit and recognize that this is not the only way to think about behavior from a biological perspective. I'd call the perspective that I just briefly outlined an adaptationist perspective, although that word has become somewhat politicized. But the value of the term, I think, is in a straightforward identification of the core unit of analysis, which is the structure of evolved adaptations. What equipment do we possess? How does it work? And why does it work that way? But there's another way to approach the question of behavior, and this is one that explains behavioral outcomes as a consequence of underlying genotypic differences across and between individuals in a population. For example, a gene or an allele that is present in some members of the population, but not in others. And together, these traits, both universal systems and unique features, necessarily work together to condition behavior. For example, assuming there is an evolved anger system in humans that has evolved to play a role in conflict resolution, we can imagine two general principles about its operation. First, it's what you might call its information processing logic. is likely universal or near universal in the population due to having been favored by natural selection. Now, there are exceptions to that. Natural selection doesn't always work to spread things to fixation in a population, but in general it does. And it's just sufficient to now, for now, to note that there are exceptions to that. Second, individual genetic differences between individuals may have unique effects on the operation of that system. So there might be this evolved anger system that's universal in the population, but second, these individual genetic differences between individuals might have unique effects on the operation of that system for any given individual. For example, work very famous now and a bit provocative, we can talk about this as well, work on the MAO gene, MAOA gene, sometimes dubbed the warrior gene, has demonstrated that the presence of this gene in an individual can make that individual more impulsive when challenged than those individuals without this gene. Okay, so now personally, I find the idea of the existence of adaptations for coalitional competition, aggression, warfare, right, depending on how we're defining things, I find this really fascinating. So this has largely been the direction of my own research focus, and I've not myself tended to also look at any set of biological differences between individuals that might also help to explain behavior. But as research has recently gravitated more and more heavily toward the puzzle of extremist violence, I think this is now the sort of what's in vogue in conflict studies is on the one hand, counterinsurgency, so-called hybrid warfare, new forms of warfare, this new landscape of warfare that's developed. And one part of that is this phenomenon known as extremist violence. And along the way, I have noticed that this two-way framework for thinking about behavior, recognizing the juxtaposition of universal systems and individual biological uniquenesses, this two-way framework seems particularly useful for thinking about extremist violence. And I can offer at least two reasons why that is. First, although not everyone agrees, my opinion is that extremist violence is basically a technologically savvy variation of what students of animal conflict would readily label as an instance of parochial altruism. What's that? Parochial altruism, maybe we're all familiar with that, but in case some are not, this is basically a kind of spiteful violence in which one incurs a cost to oneself in order to deliver costs to an outgroup in the context of intergroup competition. A very obvious and extreme and classic form of this is, of course, the suicide bomber who sacrifices their life to damage an outgroup on behalf of one's own group. So thinking about extremist violence simply as a form of parochial altruism immediately places us to some degree in the adaptationist camp, to the extent that we're saying that this output, extremist violence, is a product of a system that was designed long ago to aid in contexts of warfare or intergroup competition more broadly. So I might also label this perspective, consequently, banality of evil approach, which is to say the following, that we all possess the machinery necessary to walk the path of radicalization and even extreme violence under the right circumstances. And from this perspective, the only real thing that distinguishes, let's say, you and I from a radical extremist is a tragic but predictable cocktail of timing and circumstance. So the first reason that this framework can be useful is because the adaptationist perspective, one side of the framework, helps us to realize that even these very modern, novel, complex problems often reflect the expression of extremely old pressures and tendencies for which we are adapted to solve. But the second reason that this framework is useful is that, of course, the adaptationist perspective can't be the whole story. In other words, we must also ask, can it be that some individuals really, truly just are more violent than the rest of us? Okay, so let's call that the bad apple approach. So the banality of evil approach now has substantial research behind it, ranging from work on parochial altruism, as I already mentioned, but also very compelling and I think convincing reformulations of identity-centric models, such as Scott Atran's devoted actor model and Kruglanski's quest for significance model. In my reading, these seem to be the two most prominent models for explaining extremist violence. Okay. In parallel, however, the bad apple approach sets out to identify a set of biological markers that condition a propensity for violence and explain why some individuals may be intrinsically more inclined toward violence than others. So what does this, what does a bad apple approach look like in practice? I think our first impression might be that a uniqueness approach, or this bad apple approach to extremist violence, for some of us might mean looking at personality differences. Okay. And that's only partly true because unique personalities can be produced by universal mechanisms that we all possess, being calibrated with unique environments in very unique ways. So that disclaimer aside, there surely are personality differences that are also sometimes a function of actual biological differences between individuals. So whether we're talking about whether they are a function of calibrated universality or biological differences, there has been active research on the personality traits and individual attributes that correlate with support for violence or violent extremism specifically. Some that stand out are the following. Now, probably in our decades-long tireless effort to shape a profile of the extremist, I think the two variables that have really stood the test of time across time and space are age and sex, right? Predominantly, we're talking about young males. Beyond that, however, if we're thinking about personality traits or individual attributes, some that have been correlated with violent extremism are being low on openness, openness being one of the big 5 personality traits that psychologists have identified. So low openness, low empathy, relatively high sensation seeking, such as a hunger for novelty, adventure, excitement. So this is right. This is like what Yoda tells Luke Skywalker: adventure and excitement. A Jedi craves not these things, which is very interesting because, you know, if you look at the Star Wars saga, Jedi are basically the exact opposite of violent extremists, right? Which is why in the movies it's so dramatic that Count Dooku is an extremist and nobody can believe this because he was a Jedi. Anyways, that's a big long tangent. Cognitive rigidity is another individual correlate of extremist violence, is this sort of inflexible categorical thinking. Now, in terms of individual differences, there's also been very important neuropsychological discovery. For example, willingness to fight and die. And this research has really been done largely within the last 5 years. So this is cutting edge stuff that's very interesting and exciting that's been coming out. Willingness to fight and die for a cause appears correlated with activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Other studies have shown that lesions damage in this area, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is associated with greater acceptance of radical opinions as well as behaviors. Many of you probably know of Richard Wrangham's long and fantastic work in the area of warfare and violence. And he's got a recent book called The Goodness Paradox, in which he distinguishes 2 types of violence: reactive aggression from proactive aggression. Reactive aggression categorizes those forms of aggression that are immediate responses to threat, involving anger and high adrenaline and things like that. You can think about this as the classical situation of the altercation in the bar between 2 guys who are just having this sort of status contest, and it escalates beyond complete proportion to the initial issue, which may have been like who was next at turn at the billiards table, right? In contrast to proactive aggression, which is not immediately preceded by obvious arousal or immediate threat. Proactive aggression is deliberate and delayed. There's a planning process, and there's the relative absence of emotion. So in this book, Wrangham distinguishes these 2 types of aggression, and he points out that the prefrontal cortex is particularly responsible for control of the emotions, and that individuals with injuries to this area are more prone, consequently, to proactive aggression. Furthermore, in discussing work by Adrian Rain in 1994, he reports that in a population of murderers, in California prisons. So Rain went to California, went to these California prisons and collected this data from prisoners and California murderers specifically. And what he found is that although all prisoners had relatively high limbic system activity, the limbic system is responsible for processing emotional responses. So although all prisoners had relatively high limbic system activity, those involved in reactive aggression type murders, so crimes of passion, for example, demonstrated less activity in their prefrontal cortex than other murderers, for example, those who were involved in proactive aggression. Now, in contrast, if you look at psychopaths, okay, psychopaths represent just under 1% of the population. And they tend to have an amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, that is smaller and less active, sometimes deformed than the rest of the population, indicating that while they are less prone to reactive aggression, they may nevertheless be more prone to proactive aggression, which represents predatory forms of cold aggression that can be seen as relatively unemotional. So this is just a very brief survey of some of the ways of thinking about behavior and one specific form of behavior, violence, from two very different but also complementary perspectives. Both perspectives must be acknowledged. The universality and uniqueness perspectives together reveal that behavior is facilitated by a complex, evolved coalitional psychology. It's present in all of us, and it's calibrated by stimuli outside and internal to the body, but also works to process information and generate behavior as a function of person-specific biological uniqueness. So that's all I have right now, and I want to save the rest for discussion, and I thank you for your time.
Well, again, thank you so much to both Daniel and Anthony for two important and excellent discussions. I appreciate both of them. So let me just make my pitch, and then we will finally open it up to your conversations. And this is a topic that elicits, a lot of different viewpoints. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, well, my talk's Creative Destruction, War, Truth, and Nature. I teach at Villanova University. I teach a course, a couple of courses, one of them on American foreign policy, and the United States seems to be at war very often. Oh, I see something here. I'm supposed to admit somebody would do something here. Maybe not. In any case, the United States has been at war a lot during our history, and so that comes up frequently in the course on American foreign policy. I also teach a course on theories of war and peace, and there I do a pretty traditional history, looking at the cultures and the reasons for wars in different societies, starting with the written record of the human past, and then focusing on the international period, which traditionally begins in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, and then going on up until today. So those are two sort of standard fare for me. And then over the last 15 years or so, I've gotten hooked on big history. The idea that the sciences have instructed us about the steps of a very long past. And then the question is, how does war, which is an important topic along with lots of other topics, fit in to this? How does big history help us talk about that? Now, in many ways, this is not anything that's new. One of the most common phrases from Aristotle's book on the politics is that humans are he said men, are by nature a political animal. And that's interesting because, so what is nature for Aristotle, and what is human nature that makes us political? And then another quote, which everybody knows, is Clausewitz's quote on that war is the continuation of politics by other means. So if we are a political animal by nature. And if politics is somehow, you know, sort of linked very often with war, it raises a bit of a sophomoric question, which is good for teaching. You know, is human nature by nature warlike or peaceful? Or is it nurture? Do we have malleable change? Is culture socially constructed? Can it be deconstructed and then reconstructed in order to achieve what we want? Now the first one, postmodernists as a rule take a dim view of the sciences and nature because they see it as presenting something which is fixed, making it conservative, making it opposed to change, and the idea that you can reconstruct a new reality. So a kind of a traditional Aristotelian, Ptolemaic, you know, universe has the Earth at the center. It's at rest. It's terra firma. It's a rocky planet, and it doesn't move, and then all this stuff moves around us. So that idea in Aristotle has very much influenced us and continues to influence us because we sort of see that it's not just the Aristotelian universe, which is built on a solid, firm foundation, but our intellectual constructs are seen as being best if they're unchanging, consistent, and at the center of things in many ways. I teach at a Catholic university, and the Catholic tradition has contributed its notion of something built on the rock, right? The Three Little Pigs have the house built out of brick. We've got a church built on the rock. And so Peter comes from the word rock. And this is because it is unchanging. It's fixed. It's settled. This is something you can count on in things. This has influenced our thinking about education. You know, here's any number of writings about education says that a good education should be built on a strong foundation of course design. Buildings and education are best when they are firmly built on foundations which are best be on rocks which are unmoving and which stay put without all of this change and fluidity and so on. That's influenced my own department's way of explaining what our major in political science is. We tell students it's a great thing to major in political science at Villanova University, and you should begin with 4 foundational courses, right, which are built on a firm foundation. And so at the center of our campus, we've got a nice a church built out of rocks, and it's built on a firm foundation, and our education is built on a firm foundation. So this is a fairly common, you know, influence of geological thinking on education and culture. Now, other cultures, of course, think rather differently about truth. Rather than being set and unchanging, at rest, on a firm foundation, the Maya Popol Vuh, it emphasizes a dynamic relationship among hero twins, conversations among many gods, the levels of cosmos, the relationship between male and female, living and dead. There's a constant dynamic set of relationships. So they don't talk about firm foundations and putting culture on rock. Or the famous examples in Hindu of Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu. Here you've got a representation of a dynamic, ongoing relationship among creation, sustenance, and destruction. The truth is not one thing. Kierkegaard told us the purity of heart is to will one thing. Well, that's not a Hindu perspective. You've got many things going on here. What do the sciences tell us? Now, what is our study of nature about? Now, Aristotle said that we are by nature political animals. If that's true, what are the sciences telling us about nature from which human nature finally evolves? really recently, since the Big Bang took place 13.82 billion years ago, humans, Homo sapiens, have only been around for 300,000 years. That's a blink of an eye in all of this. So it's still true, I think, that human nature emerges from nature. It's just that we have a very different view about nature than what Aristotle had, which isn't his fault. It would be our fault if over the last 2,500 years we hadn't learned anything. So it's not some slight against Aristotle that we think differently about that. But what the physicists and the astronomers and the chemists and the biologists emphasize all the time is that nature is not fixed and settled and unchanging. Instead, we have this thing called the Big Bang, or whatever it is that we should call that. And then you have a series of steps which lead us from that point until the future. And the truth is more about emergence and development. No doubt, from our point of view, with long periods of sustenance or set properties for periods of time, but that they change, and that they change quite dramatically over time. And that rock that's so settled that we had hoped to set things on. The geologists tell us, man, rocks move down, they get heated, they get folded, they get thrust back up. And in our own time periods, this can be a rather slow development. In geologic time, these things are going on all the time. And of course, it can happen very quickly too with earthquakes, that the earth underneath our feet changes just within seconds. So what does this have to do with war? And how should we think about a war given these changing notions about nature and the influences of the science on how we talk about the political? And part of it is rather unfortunate, isn't it? That language, kind of off the cuff use of language, then starts to focus our attentions, maybe erroneously. Fred Hoyle, who was an astronomer, and did not agree in the 1940s with the theory, with what became known as the Big Bang theory. He rejected that. And he was asked about the theory, which didn't have a popular name at that point. And he dismissed it. He says, oh yeah, like everything started with a Big Bang. It's a dismissive term. It's a term by someone who rejects it, who disagrees with it. But his name stuck. And so there we are. So we see that the universe now is beginning with a bang. And somehow there's something violent about that. So the Hobbesian approach is right, isn't it? That by nature, it's a war of all against all, and life is nasty, brutish, and short. But it's just an aside, this term, the Big Bang. But it's one which is stuck. And maybe there are places where there's actually a little bit more reality to this destruction that takes place. One of the key transitions in big history is when the stars light up, when we have gravity creating such densities and heat that it can initiate fusion, most beginning with hydrogen atoms. And that, very often this is explained as, first of all, the fusion ends up turning a portion of that mass back into energy. And in that sense, there's a kind of destruction of mass or transition into energy. So it's very often said that for our sun, which is a sort of standard star, every second produces the same amount of energy as 1 trillion megaton bombs. Again, making an analogy towards something which is very destructive. Actually, of course, a megaton bomb is much more powerful than the atomic bombs which were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is a tremendous amount of energy. And then when we look at the sun's radiation, we see that it has these two qualities to it. It gives us the warmth and the heat, and it makes life possible. It also gives us cancer, and life had to come up with various strategies to protect itself from this radiation, which is very destructive. So it's both destructive and creative. in many ways. And then we go on to the stars produce elements up to iron, and then the largest of the stars explode in supernova, and along with collisions of neutron stars are what provides all of the elements higher than iron, and go spewing out into the universe, and then that's what enables us. So I've got to admit someone here. Pardon me while I do that. And this is very often described as an explosion of a supernova, or the death of a supernova, or of a massive star. And so again, along with the Big Bang, we use these kind of military terms to explain astronomical events, at least in popular science, and that influences us in how we think about nature. So it kind of gives a little bit of a Hobbesian feel to it. Then, of course, this one of the next stages in big history is the accretion. All of these heavy elements which are spewed out, gravity starts bringing them back together, and 4.56 billion years ago, we start to have the accretion of planet Earth. And this goes on for some hundreds of millions of years during a period referred to routinely as the late heavy bombardment. And here we've got the universe bombarding us with missiles, and of course it's true that Earth was not a very pleasant place for life to emerge during all of this. It's molten, it's hot, it's like a magma around the Earth, and then we're getting pelted with all of this. So the universe looks pretty destructive as well as creative at the same point. The Earth is being created, it's being accreted, but it's also, hostile to any life at this point. And then things get even worse. We have Theta, or some planetoid, colliding with the early Earth, and the Earth has this huge explosion, this cannonball, which comes in and knocks us off. And from that, we get the formation of the moon. So we've got this dichotomy of creation and destruction, of violence and emergence, which is part of the big history story. Finally, when we get to the story of the emergence of life, and 4 billion years ago, 3.8 billion years ago, somewhere around there, you have life, and then you've got conflict among life forms. You've got bacteria fighting with each other, viruses fighting with bacteria, and so you have the emergence of life and the struggle and the conflict among forms of life pretty much right from the beginning. And we're pretty familiar with these endlessly repeated images that go on now of a simple virus causing us endless trouble. And this fascinating, from a theory of war point of view, this fascinating situation of quorum sensing, where sometimes bacteria will reproduce before they attack a host. They organize themselves somehow, and it's sort of a targeted attack which they do. What this means, what does it mean for single cells to sense their total population and then to organize an attack? What it means is quite striking. You have the story that we all know about an amoeba engulfing a bacteria and then using it for its nutrients. We're a long ways from war over resources, oil, territory, land, sea routes, and so on. But maybe there's a bit of a continuity. So there this Hobbesian interpretation. Then you've got a more Rousseauian interpretation coming from people like Lynn Margulis, who emphasizes not all of this violence and mayhem in the natural world, but that there's a lot of exchange among them. There's a lot of literal intercourse between them, which benefits them, which leads to greater complexity. And I won't get into all of her ideas of symbiogenesis, but just the idea that these simple life forms will share, and through their sharing, they become more complex and they are able to survive more. Or her ideas of horizontal gene transfer. Now, this is before there's any sex. In fact, reproduction through the history of life has been asexual much longer than it's been sexual. So we didn't have male and female during the first couple of billion years, but we still could have gene transfers between cells, which would enable them more effectively to evolve and to respond to environmental changes. So these are more, you know, this is, the universe is a more social entity rather than a Hobbesian one. And then when we do get to more complex, the eukaryote cells, away from the, there, you know, the horizontal gene transfer is a little more difficult to set up. And so we do move towards sexual reproduction. And Matt Ridley's got this interesting book on the Red Queen, which came out about 10 years ago now. But his argument is that, well, why do we have sex if we could reproduce asexually for so much longer, and then it seemed to work out pretty well. In fact, bacteria can reproduce every 20 minutes or so. That's better than we can do. So why not stick with asexual reproduction? And his argument is that for complex life forms, there's a battle going on with bacteria. He says there may be sexier reasons for having sex, but trying to stay one step ahead of pathogens might be one way, that it enables evolution to respond to pathogens a little more effectively than they would otherwise. His argument is more complicated than that, but I think that's the gist of it. And of course, we have the whole idea of the microbiome, that there are tens of millions more bacteria and prokaryote and anaerobic bacteria in and on our bodies than there are cells which make us up. And most of them are, you know, either neutral or they're beneficial for us. So if there again, you've got this Lynn Margulis approach of emphasizing, when you look at big history and the different steps, that nature can be social and cooperative as much as it can be violent. But then back to the violent stage, you know, the typical story of the Cambrian period, which starts about a little over 500 million years ago, is that it's an arms race. You've got this unending development and evolution of an array of defensive and offensive capabilities and behaviors, and that this is one of the things which drives evolution, this constant war of all against all, which is in one sense creative to the degree that it spurs evolution. And we've got all kinds of examples of pretty, you know, combative looking critters, you know, even the jellyfish, which are so pleasant, you know, they're part of the Nidarians, and they've got this harpoon, which we all know, stay away from jellyfish, they can sting you. So it's this idea of beauty, of sociability, of violence, of destruction, of hostility, all going together. And of course, we all know, we'll get to the dinosaurs and all that. And then we're all experts on Velociraptor, having seen Jurassic Park, and we know that now it's not quorum sensing. Now you've got complex, intelligent creatures coordinating attacks, and we've got that story. Then we got those ants, you know, the worst ones are the army ants, but it's just your pavement ants, which are going to war. We've all seen pavement ant wars going on. And so we've got, you know, is nature violent and destructive? Is it creative? Is it emergent? Is it evolutionary? And then we've got, you know, none of those critters made the cut for the casting for Bambi. You know, the idea that nature is always and only sociable and so on. Now, then we get, of course, to the famous story of the meteorite that hit off the coast of Yucatan 65 million years ago, and perhaps contributing, if not causing, the destruction of the non-avian dinosaurs, which is good for creation for the mammals anyway, because there's mammals before that, but now they've got the space to evolve and develop in all kinds of ways. The fact that they had a common origin, no doubt, is little comfort to the gazelle being eaten by a lion, but nevertheless, you have the development of mammals, and finally, you get up to the primates and to the hominids. The chimps and the bonobos are our closest living cousins, and there, Jane Goodall and others have tried to show us the contrast between their natures. They live together in troops. They're very social in that regard. On the other hand, the chimps can commit infanticide, and troops can have unprovoked attacks on the troops of chimpanzees. Or you got the bonobos, right? Who argue, let's have sex and not wars. Let's not shake hands or bump elbows when we greet each other. Let's have sex, and that's a great way to alleviate any tensions. And then we've got the whole story, and this is all familiar, because you don't have to, the development from Australopithecus and Homo habilis and Homo erectus, and finally Homo sapiens. The development of perhaps sticks and stones for most likely gathering crops, and then hunting and perhaps weapons starting around 500,000 years ago. And then early examples of here now getting quite recent, 9,000 years ago or so, Kennewick man having indicated some trauma. He was discovered in Washington. He had a fractured rib, it had healed. He had a depression fracture on his forehead. It looks as though he had a spear jab that healed. It looks like there was some violence in his community. Or the famous story of Otzi, the Iceman, who's up in the mountains there on the northern border of Italy, and where it's pretty clear, because he's got an arrow head lodged in his back and wounds on his hand that he was forcibly killed. This isn't war, but it's the use of force early on. So it's not the state which causes war. There's no states. There's something else in human nature. When we do get to the state, there still seems to be war. This is the famous Narmer palette from about the 31st century BC, about over 5,000 years ago. And this is interesting. This is the unity of upper and lower northern and southern Egypt into a single state. And here we have our hero who's uniting this, creating this new nation. But he's doing that by, on the left side, he's ready to smite this poor fellow who's a prisoner. On the right side, as you can see, we have people who have already been smitten. These are fellows lined up. They are all decapitated, and their heads are sitting there between their legs right now. And here's our hero marching behind his lesser servants in the creation of Egypt. So politically, we get to this notion of the creation coming out of war or destruction. And then, there's a series of examples of this sort of thing. We've got the American War of Independence, and then we've got the creation of a nation. We've got the picture up here. Here we've got the Napoleonic Wars, and then we've got the Concert of Europe and the Treaty of Vienna, and almost a century of more or less peace in Europe. We have the First World War, and then we've got at least a 20 years hiatus, and we got the Second World War, and we have the liberal world order, which has more or less held sway until now. And now we're wondering if we're seeing the emergence of a new world order. Is the US-led liberal world order giving way to something else with the rise of China. And there's great anxiety about this. And Graham Allison has been warning us about the Thucydides trap, by which he means that the rising power might run into the dominant power, and that he claims in 12 out of 16 cases in the last 500 years, that's led to war. It's not inevitable, but it's a yellow flag he's raising. And so we're typically asking about that. Or we've had this recent war going on between Israel and Hamas. And there you've got a war in 1948, which establishes the state of Israel. That's experienced as Nakba, or destruction by the Palestinians. So the same event combines creation and destruction. Then we had the wars of 67 and 73. That sustains Israel's survival. We have wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is, at least for us, but finally coming to an end after the longest war in American history, as well as uses of force in Libya and Syria. That's transformed the Middle East. It's established Israel as the region's dominant power. And then this recent bombing of Gaza and the steady increases in settlements in the West Bank are gradually establishing greater Israel. You have destruction and emergence and creation mix. So anyway, finally, so where does this all lead? How can we place a war in the story of nature that the sciences give us? And when we talk about war, we very often talk about the causes of war, what leads to war, what brings us to war. Very often we talk about how wars are fought, right? The History Channel is sort of all Hitler all the time. It's just one series of battles after the next, and that's where a lot of attention is given. There's some attention, but less very often on how wars end, which is important. And then it's very important for us to include in the discussions what emerges from this destruction. Not that this is to be lauded, it's terribly unfortunate, but so far, now maybe the exception would be a general exchange of nuclear weapons. That would just be destruction. It's hard to imagine any creativity coming out of that. But short of that, we have new social and political structures emerging after wars, and that there is a dynamic between that. So where are we then? Well, truth is not settled. The idea that you've got changing, emergent nature, which is evolving and continues to evolve. The choice is not between nature and nurture. We are now that part of the universe which can not only reflect on itself, but which can, to a degree anyway, create itself. And of course, that is the great challenge facing us at this point, is that we have to do better this time than they did at the Congress of Vienna. They did pretty well. They created more or less European peace for a century. There were some significant exceptions to that, but there was no general conflict for a century. We've reached whatever it is, 80 years or something since the end of the Second World War. We haven't done quite as well as they did at the Congress of Vienna, but we're 20 years from matching that. We have to do better. We can't just have a peace for 100 years, because what we are now able to do to ourselves and are doing to ourselves in other respects with the war on nature that we seem to be conducting, the great challenge now is to emphasize the emergence without the destruction. Is it possible? Or is the future one of destruction that is so total that there will be no opportunity for creation afterwards? And with that, finally, I will come to a conclusion. And thank you all. And now, finally, we will hold our peace for a moment and ask you for your questions, for your comments. I think that you can unmute yourself. If you can't, let me know. Anyway, who's brave enough to start us off with your insight?
Hello?
Yes,
Can you guys hear me?
Gabriel, go ahead.
Okay, so I actually have a question on how does this translate from the macro perspective into a moment in time? Because as much as the general definitions that were given, they make sense and they're concise, how would this connect to, say one historian, he wants to understand one conflict in one moment of time? What are the main contributions that this macro perspective can give to someone who is studying the micro scale?
Daniel or Anthony, let me ask you to go ahead and
I can say something about this. Gabriel, thank you for your question. The fact is, you can't understand the micro without the micro without the macro. You know, for example, we are talking here. Lowell was talking about the Congress of Vienna. For example, we can understand the decisions made in Vienna if you employ if you try to understand these decisions, taking in consideration the algorithms that regulates social conflicts and social coalitions in primates. I won't say that the macro vision substitutes the macro substitutes the micro, but I think the macro perspective, it enhances the comprehension of the micro. You know, I think that's the link. You can make it deeper than the micro perspective is. You know.
No, I definitely agree with that. I'm just trying to put this into exercise because this is a first to me. I'm novel to this. So I'm trying to integrate this to my set of tools, which is kind of hard at the first step. Try.
I suggest you to read the Mediterranean by Brodel. Brodel does this very well. You know, we can talk about this later if you want to. I have a question.
good.
Okay, one question for Anthony and one for Lowell. You know? Anthony, you were picturing this profile of violent extremists, and they are young males mostly. It's the same profile, the most common profile for criminal activity all around the world, etc. Yeah, we have young males, and risk behavior is mostly defined by sexual selection, mostly in many mammals and also in primates. If risk behavior is related to sexual selection in humans, maybe extremist action like suicide bombers, etc., are non-adaptive because they are killing themselves before mating or mostly before mating. Do you think this kind of behavior that can or cannot, we can discuss this, be related to sexual selection along the human lineage? It became a non-adaptative trait because it's not maladaptive because you don't have so much destruction caused by suicide bombers that make some demographic impression to cause this trait to become maladaptive. But it's can we see this as some kind of leftover from evolution that now is causing us a lot of trouble, politically speaking?
There is a lot to unpack there, I think. I'm not sure where to start. So I I'm just going to respond with the last thing I heard, which was the issue of suicide bombing being an instance of a behavior that is not adaptive. And it may be that it's maladaptive, but it's hard to say that it is maladaptive, because we're talking about when you're talking about whether something's adaptive or not adaptive, you're making a claim about whether or not some trait is enhancing reproductive success of an organism over many generations. And so it's almost by definition not knowable until some future point. And I also don't know how useful it is to think in terms of whether or not something today is adaptive or maladaptive. For me, it's more useful to ask what is the mechanism that is driving behavior, and what environment is it adapted to, and how is it responding to this new environment? And so you can think about suicide bombing if you're of the opinion that this kind of extremist behavior is basically a form of parochial altruism. Then you can say that this is an example of an adaptive behavior, incurring costs to impose damage on an outgroup for the sake of your own group. That happens to occur in the context of, I can't remember if Daniel, maybe both you and Lowell made the point, but it occurs in the context of a world where lethality, where violence is easy to purchase, is easy to come by. Individuals can impose tremendous damage now, more so than any time in the past. And so we're capable of, let's say, to use the term again, we're capable of maladaptive levels of violence, where in the past, those same sorts of impulses or patterns of behavior would not have necessarily resulted in one strapping a bomb on their bodies, because there were no bombs to strap on one's body in the Pleistocene, let's say. So, I mean, we think all the time, we can imagine all the time, we identify all the time instances of behavior that served a purpose in ancestral environments that nowadays, on the one hand, may be maladaptive, on the other hand, certainly lead to poor health outcomes, right? And so for me, it's sufficient to say, well, this is a sort of mismatch, right? This is a behavior that is produced and generated that makes sense in one environment and maybe makes a little less sense in a new environment.
Yes.
I'm sure that I missed something.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
Yes. Thank you for the three brilliant presentations by Daniel and Anthony and Lowell. And my question is to Lowell. You have presented very well through the physical evolution of the universe, and also the life genetic evolution, and also the spiritual evolution, and how these violent transformations are bringing a creative way of transformation. So my question is that as human beings, we are rational and spiritual. And how in this 21st century, how is it possible for us to bring more creative transformation without the violence? Is there any way of new modes of thinking, action, or plans?
Yeah, that's a great question. Personally, I'm never quite sure what to do with the word spiritual, because it talks about spirits, but I do understand that a term imaginative, something. It seems to me that what's striking about the macro story is that nature itself, somehow, what words do we use? The language breaks down at a certain point, but in any case, nature leads to things that had not existed in nature before. In other words, at the Big Bang, there were no stars, and then there were no terrestrial planets, and then there was no life, and then there were no mammals, and then it's just a series of nature transcending itself. Can we say that nature can imagine something which has not yet existed? I don't even know what words to use in that regard. But in that way, I think that humanity comes out of a natural evolution which can transcend itself. So can we imagine, and if that's what spiritual means, I think that I can maybe understand it. Can we, like the universe, can we be as creative as the eukaryote cell, who maybe tried to digest a mitochondrial cell, but instead formed a very mutually beneficial relationship that has gone on to last 1.5 billion years? Can we be as creative as nature has been in the past without causing destruction, but causing greater and new levels of complexity, which maybe the highest forms of complexity of relationships between us are called what? Caritas or something else. Is this possible? And if that's what it means to be spiritual, I think that would be natural to do that. That would be consistent with what the story is in the past. It's possible. It's also possible that we won't. But at least there's not an inevitability. I get from my students very often a certain sense of pessimism that we're just doomed to destroy ourselves through environmental catastrophe or nuclear war or however we want to do that. I don't think that's just the story of nature. So I think if that's what being spiritual is, I'm on board. I don't know if that's a good answer.
Yeah, thank you.
I should ask you to answer it.
Yes.
I'd like to ask a question of Anthony Lopez.
Great.
Both in your presentation and your response to Daniel, you defined extremist violence in terms of parochial altruism, but I don't really see how. It seems like to me that parochial altruism doesn't really pick out extremist violence from other forms of violence, because if you're a man in a small nation state and there's a war occurs and you volunteer to become a soldier and you go fight in the war in order to protect your family and your homeland, that's just as much an instance of parochial altruism as the kind of extremist violence that you were discussing.
Sorry, that was the end of your question. Okay, so yeah, no, I think you're right, Nick. I 100% agree with you. I'm not proposing parochial altruism as the end of the story, but I think it is the necessary starting point. It's the common denominator, right? And I think that you can't stop with that, which is why I also mentioned these other approaches that I think are really good at capturing a big portion of what is going on when we're looking at the puzzle of extremist behavior. The two I mentioned were Scott Atran's do you know these, the devoted actor model by Scott Atran and many of his colleagues at Artists, and another is the Quest for Significance model by Kruglansky and several of his collaborators. And they basically, do they both? Yeah, they're both basically revised and expanded versions of social identity theory. Social identity was developed in the 70s by Tversky and Kahneman to explain why and how groups compete because they care about their identities and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And decades later, now in the context of this seemingly very new, and it is new, I don't mean to diminish its novelty, this new phenomenon of extremist violence, thinking about conflict as something that's driven by ideational differences or conflicts of identity seems relevant, but also, Nick, like you're pointing out, seems incomplete. It seems like there's something more to the story. And so researchers, particularly social psychologists, behavioral economists, neuropsychologists have done great collaborative work at looking at, so the devoted actor model, for example, combines these two perspectives. One, the idea of identity fusion, that there's some sort of moment of visceral oneness that we experience with another group. And then when combined with the relevance of sacred values, we are motivated to take great risks to protect those sacred values when they're threatened. Kruglansky's model is sometimes called it's called the Quest for Significance model, and he poses, much like the social identity theorists decades before him, who posited that let's say the quest for identity was at the heart of why we joined groups and defended them. Kruglansky and his collaborators talk about the quest for significance. We have this sort of intrinsic desire to matter. They don't explain where it came from, whether it's like adaptive in some way. It's just sort of like the uncaused cause in their model. We have this desire for, we all want to matter, we all want to mean something. And that can play out in very sort of domestic, pacific ways, but it can also play out in very extreme, violent ways under the right conditions. And so, this whole effort by behavioral scientists has been an effort to identify what are those conditions. But all of it is basically saying the same thing, which is why I'm not super invested in the particulars of the theory, but rather I'm just sort of inviting us to zoom out and to see that all of these theories are saying, look, we all have the same equipment. What is that equipment and how does it interact with these specific environmental stimuli, whether they're supernormal and evolutionarily novel or whether they are not. So there's these approaches that posit that we have this psychic universality, we have the same systems. And so the quest is to identify and define those systems that are online, interacting with specific environments that lead us, that help us understand the path from normalcy to radicalization. And then there's this other collection of researchers who are saying, yes, but why this guy and not that guy? Why do some people seem inherently more prone to violence? Why is it that it seems like it's not just about conditions and a response to stimuli, but there's seems to be some like motivated bias, let's say, in some individuals that might make them more prone to extremist violence than others. And so then that leads to a different way of asking these kinds of questions. So to return to your initial question, Nick, I completely agree with you. And I think that is the, $65 million question right now. And the models that I think are most convincing of that are the devoted actor model and the quest for significance model.
Specifically about extremist violence, if you don't mind putting yourself out on a limb, would you prefer yourself to define it in terms of the methodologies used, like suicide bombing? Most people would consider that an extremist technique. Or would you prefer to define it in terms of the ideology that motivates that violence? Would be if we can adjudicate among ideologies that are extremist and non-extremist, or some combination of the two?
I think a combination of the two, because it certainly seems to be an intersection of belief and behavior. You're going to have extreme behavior without extreme beliefs. You're going to have extreme beliefs without extreme behavior. And either of those dimensions, either of those blocks on the 2x2 matrix should seem to be not quite what we're thinking of when we're talking about extreme behavior. But I want to emphasize that this is kind of like up to us. I don't think we can stumble upon some objective discovery that, oh, this is what extremist violence is. It is, I think, ultimately a question of what is most useful for us as researchers. So at the end of the day, that definition has to be methodologically useful. But in my opinion, that's how I see extremist violence is that intersection of belief and behavior. Not so much method. So behavior, I'd have a more truncated view of behavior, not so much like, the kinds of weapons you're using or things like that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone, please.
Yes, thanks. I've been toggling between these two evolution seminars today, so I'm sorry if my question or my point is out of order, but on the premise that Big History, and I'm a member of the Big History board, on the premise that Big History is struggling to communicate its relevance to topical issues, and I'm not sure in some quarters whether it even finds that that's important to do, but I do. It's what draws me to the field. I have to just draw a connection that about an hour before this evolution of war seminar series began, the US Attorney General Merrick Garland was announcing a policy on domestic terrorism, which I was captivated by. And he drew the distinction between the thought and the action, that in the US, the thought is not illegal, as I understand it, and you can tell I'm not American. In Britain, I think it is. You can be guilty for thinking, you could be guilty in Britain for thinking that the Ku Klux Klan is great, but in the States you can't, but it's the action that gets you in trouble. My point is, I didn't hear, and I heard most of it by Merrick Garland. There was no reference, and maybe this is too idealistic on my part, that there was no reference to what research tells us about the human brain and about what we understand increasingly to be the causes of acting out terrorist or violent instincts. And so I just asked the speakers, do you desire that your field be better known in terms of policy? And I'll just PS this, if I may, by saying that as a geologist, I was attending the Jackson Hole wildlife festival seminars for many years, and had followed Jane Goodall's research on chimpanzees a great deal, to your points, Daniel. But it was a revelation to all the audience in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, about 5 years ago, when somebody had managed to capture filming of a group of about 30 or 40 chimpanzees that were hell-bent on being violent. And they had evidently, in the view of the researcher, decided to attack another adjacent group of chimpanzees. And the footage was amazing and left the audience in awe as these chimpanzees, heads down, looked like commandos traveling through the underbrush and going on their way to attack and kill another group. And the comment was made that, when Jane Goodall first studied chimpanzees in the 60s, she had no idea that they were capable of violence. She didn't have that in her mindset. So, again, I'm asking for reactions to the incorporation of research into what is an extremely topical area of social order in today's world.
Well, for me, the short answer is absolutely. When I was first reading a lot of the big history literature, I thought of how that could influence a number of the big issues that we're arguing about. Racism strikes me as one. What would it mean if we began our discussion of human evolution with the first emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa, that as far as we know, we are all descendants of Africans, in fact, and that our skin tones changed only after we left Africa, relatively recently, 70, 80,000 years ago. So in that sense, there are no fundamental biological differences. This is very different. I mean, we've had people historically argue that there really are separate evolutionary paths for the different races, and now we know we have a common ancestor. How could this longer term view reframe what some people seem to think about are huge differences between ethnic groups? That would at least be one. The issue in political science, we've been talking now for a couple of decades. Someone mentioned in the chat, Francis Fukuyama. Ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've talked endlessly about the process of globalization. Others want to begin in the period of European colonization. But in any case, we're consumed with the problem, the question, the issues of globalization. How would it reframe the conversation to see that there really is an Earth history, and that in many regards we are Earthlings, and that we're connected to this? So I think on a whole range of discussions that we are having and that frame our political disputes these days, it seems to me that they would often be reframed if they were put in a larger perspective.
Well, I would, thanks, Lowell. I would just segue by saying, when Congress renews itself or elects new members, it's often considered a highlight when a scientist gets elected to Congress. Or, there's lots of doctors. I think there's quite a few doctors. I'm not sure there's any geologists. I don't know about physicists. I don't think there's any big historian in Congress. But, these policies and who gets picked to be a cabinet member is not incidental. I mean, the last few hours should be a breakthrough in the realization of this country at a critical time, with more mass killings in the last 9 months or the last 6 months than in any previous year, I gather. So we've got a major, major problem, and we've got a disconnect between a body of research which could illuminate some of this issue with the reality of what's going on in the country. So, you know, I guess I'm asking if anybody has any bright thoughts about how to create an audience. You know, we have a scientific advisor to the White House, but we don't have people who advise on this stuff, I don't think.
I wonder if we could ask a question.
Of course, Jim.
Hi, Lowell. I'd like to introduce you to Wyatt. He's 9 years old, and he sat through this whole discussion. And in response to Matthew's question of how do we move forward from here, if I understood that question correctly, is we have to involve Wyatt. I'm sorry, I'm making some sort of technical extra response. But my point is that we have to involve Wyatt. Why has he sat through 2 hours of this? I'm not sure. But, you know, he did. And that's how we go forward. We engage the next generation with us, as opposed to having webinars without the previous generation. You know what I mean?
No, exactly.
Anybody know?
First of all, thank you, Wyatt, for being with us. And really, I'm very impressed that you stayed with us for this whole time. So, but your influence on us is important, because ultimately these conversations make a difference, especially insofar as they will influence your future after the rest of us who are rather long in the tooth here will be gone. Thank you for your not only your attendance, but your inspiration.
Okay.
Hi, Lowell. Sohan Jeeta, founder and chairman of Network of Researchers on the Chemical Evolution of Life. But I'm not actually going to, there's no question to be asked, because I'm on the fringe as far as this discussion is going on. But there was something really interesting you said earlier on when you were sort of giving the life history. I just want to say that the idea of sex and asexual, well, you're absolutely correct. Originally, during the time of Luca, that's the first ever living organism out of which arose others. Of course, other people think that there was more than one, but we won't debate that issue. But what we could say is this, that this Luca, literally in a way, even before Luca actually, it divided more to do with, this division was more to do with kind of mathematics. If you can imagine that as you gather more and more information and chemical within your sphere, so to speak, it will eventually collapse. It's a mathematical fact. It will collapse, and it will actually, the content will be actually separated out. And it wasn't fair, because some of those chemicals separating, they wouldn't have been equal in proportion. They may not be. I wasn't there actually, so I'm surmising that there would have actually been a more or less asymmetrical sharing of chemical content. And I'll put it to you, or put it to any biologist at that sexual aspect of our life was invented, means by which wholesale genomes and other networks within the cell, like, for example, TCS cycles and stuff like that, they could be kind of shared hard. And of course, if you look at all the cells, apart from the budding of membranes, these things do happen. I just didn't want somebody to catch me out on this. I thought I'll cover that angle first. But the point is, there almost always invariably happens at the center of sphere or a rod or whatever shape they may well be. So really, so you got this separation of happening, and it was invented wholesale passing of genome to the next generation was an invention of the time. And that's one aspect of why the sexual and asexual business came along. And the other thing is that I'm always puzzled by this, although of course that American scientist has long since died. I can't remember when, but I guess it might be back in the 80s or even 70s. Elliot J. Gould. He was a evolutionary biologist. He often said something that if life's film was to be rerun again, will the answer, the end result, I mean, we're not at the end, by the way, the end result would be mankind. That was, well, that's what it was implying. My guess is that, of course, I think that he was actually, he believed in no, the answer will not be the same. It will not end in human beings. But I would have disagreed with him wholeheartedly on the basis that actually both the chemistry, as you know, Lowell, that I am actually heavily involved with the original life people. And I've even, as you know, that I've even got my own group now, strong group, you know. And the thing about it is this, that it's the chemistry and the mathematics are actually involved together. It's the combination of both that brings us to us. The life's beginning ends with us. And you might say, so, well, hey, hold on, where's your proof? Well, I don't want to go a whole lot of proof, but I just wanted to say one thing, that my hand, for example, it serves a purpose. If you, I mean, I tried all sorts of experiments, like I kind of sellotape to my two fingers, like so, and try to live by it, you know, see how far can I go. Of course, unknown to me, there are people who are born like that, actually, a bit like Homer, you know, Homer Simpson, born like that, actually. And many years after doing that experiment, I met this guy, as it happened, I met this guy. And of course, he can't count 5, he can only count 4. His was like this, he could only count 4 on both hands. But it's very difficult to live. I mean, what I'm actually trying to tell you is that the life is kind of frozen. The evolution, certain aspect of the evolution is frozen in time, so to speak. That's one thing. The second thing where Elliot J. Gould might have been wrong is that we now know that life about up to 90% was eradicated on planet Earth at least 6 times. And all the time, it kind of, when it started again, that it ended with us. But there's two, to summarize what I've said, there's 2 aspects I said. First one, I just want to clarify the idea that there was the sexual reproduction was a necessary invention, as did all other aspects of life have been invented. Like, for example, flight is invented because the air wasn't occupied by anybody. It was there to be flown through, and obviously at least 4 different types of wings were invented, and the 40 and I was invented 40 different types. And anyway, I just want to say that the other aspect was that I wanted to tell you something about.
You know what he's talking about?
Sorry about this. I'm so sorry.
Okay, I asked Wyatt if he knew what you were talking about, because I'm not quite sure. And I'm not sure what his answer was. Is that a yes or a no, Wyatt?
Probably a no, but
Maybe no, but it's a complicated question that we're asking each other. And that's really important that we all think together about what the possible answers could be.
And I can't give an answer to the type of talks I've been talking here. I only interjected. I just wanted to bring into the equation that actually sexual reproduction was invention by life.
Yes.
It was that's all it is. And that's why Lowell was bringing in duality, you know, positive and negative sort of, I can't remember all of the dualities he brought into equation. And this one of the duality of sexual versus asexual was a specific invention. Of course, during the Cambrian period, there was another invention as well, as you know, because of the creation of eukaryotes, which is what you and I and Wyatt is. You know, we're special kind of species.
Well, I would like to thank all of you who are here. I'd like to, first of all, thank both Daniel and Anthony for excellent presentations, and thank you for excellent comments and questions. And Sohan is, and for yours is here. Nobuo reminds me it's 3 a.m. in the morning in Tokyo, and I think Matthew is quickly approaching midnight in India, and maybe we should be merciful and after 2 hours start to bring this to a close. But I should leave it open to one final question or comment if anyone would have the last word for us.
Well, I would attend it again. I would attend again. I'm sucker for learning. So basically, thank you very much, Lowell, for this excellent talks. And it's just that I got a lot of catching up to do.
Well, thank you, Sohan, and that certainly is my feeling. I'm forever, my mind is always exploding. We're trying to learn and catch up with so many brilliant people who are working, including all of those here. So anyway,
just one more thing. By the way, talking about Lowell, he's been invited to another talk, which is going to be on the 7th of January, 2022. And I have launched a new group. It's called Blue Earth Project, and Lowell will be giving talk at that. And I've got 3 other people organized. I don't want to let the cat out of the bag as yet, but they're willing to come. But please keep in touch with Lowell, and in other words, keep communicating with him. He's your front man to Blue Earth Project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to that very much in January. So anyway, I hope to see you all soon. And as you recall, we have an online conference in August, and I hope maybe some people will be able to get to its physical destination in India. But even if you can't, we would welcome you to that. And thank you for being here today. Appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you all very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lowell.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, you all.